Alrighty, we ready to rock and roll? Maybe? Possibly?
Sure.
All right, great. You're ready. So I'm Steve McLaughlin. I'm the director of the Idea Lab at Blackbaud, and I want to spend the next 90 minutes or so talking about 5 big trends in online fundraising. My goal is for this not to be 90 minutes of stand-up comedy, so if you have questions or answers, let's try and make this an interactive session. A bit about me. I've worked in the online space for a little over 15 years. I've been on the board of directors of NTEN since 2009. And I get to spend a lot of time in data and spelunking in data and finding things in data and talking about data. And so that's a lot of what I want to share with you guys here today. So let's talk about trend number 1. Trend number 1 is online giving returned to double-digit growth in 2012. Some of you recall from other sessions I've done last year, online giving was relatively flat in 2011, in part because it was so over the top up in 2010 that it leveled out. And in 2012, we returned to sort of more normal double-digit year-over-year growth rates. So some of these trends come from a report that we put out in February called the 2012 Charitable Giving Report. We looked at data from a little over 3,000 nonprofit organizations, about $8 billion in fundraising, and then we also looked at about 2,500 organizations and their online data, about $500 million worth of online data, and broke it down by size and sector. And you can get this report at blackbaud.com/charitable giving, and sort of want to share some of the highlights that talk about how did we get to double-digit growth and what happened. The first thing that we found was that while overall giving online was up about 11%, there are definitely some different size of organizations that did better than others on a year-over-year basis. Small organizations, those less than $1 million in total fundraising revenue, grew by about 12%. Medium-sized organizations, those between 1 and 10 million in annual revenue, grew by about 14%. And large organizations actually grew the smallest amount, a little over 7%. So a double-digit trend, but some organizations of different sizes performing better than others. The other thing that we looked at was organizations by different sectors, and we found there that every single sector that we looked at had positive year-over-year growth, which was not the case in 2011. In 2011, we had international affairs had a pretty substantial decrease in year-over-year giving. So in 2012, we saw every sector was up. That was led by the education sector, followed by organizations that get classified as public and society benefits. So some orgs having double-digit growth, almost 18% growth. Others, like international affairs, having a little over 1% year-over-year growth. But for those organizations, that's positive since they were really in the negative category in the prior year. Now, to put this in context, let's think about in terms of the overall sector. Based on our analysis, overall giving in 2012 only grew by about 2%. So overall giving grew by about 2%, online grew by 11%. And if you could look at the sector comparison of overall giving, it is a very different story. About 4 sectors had positive year-over-year growth in terms of overall fundraising, and 4 sectors had negative growth in terms of overall fundraising. So again, online has been an upside area for nonprofit organizations, continues to be. In a little bit, I'll talk about sort of the makeup of online giving and how much of overall fundraising it is. But to be clear, across all sectors, it continues to be a very positive way from a fundraising perspective. We do this report on an annual basis, but if you're curious, every month we publish this data. So if you go to blackbaud.com/blackbaudindex, every month, about the first of every month, we publish details in terms of overall giving and online giving, and it's got a cool interactive chart, and you can break it down by size and sector. So if you're in environment and animal welfare and you want to know how you're doing compared to your peers, you just go play with the chart. So every year we look at this stuff, but you can actually look at it every month and get a sense of which way things are trending in the sector. Now, overall giving growing is great, but when you dig into a lot of data, you find other interesting things that happen in this sort of combination of both online giving and offline giving. So let's talk about first-year donor retention rate, something really interesting we found when we dig into the data, which is when you look at overall donor retention, so first-year donor retention, an offline-only donor, a person who only gives offline, could be through check, direct mail, direct marketing, telephone, that's the only channel they give to, they have about a 29% retention rate. An online-only donor has a 23% retention rate, so 6 points lower. And what's interesting here is I love the internet. The internet is great, and it's great for online giving, but online donors by themselves are not as loyal as an offline donor. And we see this in the data year over year over year. And the point that I would make is it's not online versus offline anymore. It's multi-channel. You have to think multi-channel. And so in the data, where does multi-channel show up? And when you look at first-year donor retention, a multi-channel donor, meaning someone who's given both online and offline, in the following year, their retention rate is 58%. So I'm a decalculus student, but I know that 58% is a lot better than 29% and a lot better than 23%. Now, when we talk about this data, a lot of times I'll get questions like, yeah, but doesn't it vary by age or other types of things? People are always looking for what the catch is. And so we dug into the data to look at it by age. Is there something happening with age here? So here's first-year donor retention by age. And what's really fascinating is the online-only donor who is 75 years old or above is more loyal than the 18 to 24, the 25 to 34, the 35 to 44, right? And so we have to sort of unlearn things that we think are true, which is age has something to do with it. No, once you get into a particular channel, you start to behave a particular way. And also, when you look at multi-channel donors, the online and offline donor, again, their retention rates across the board are so much better than just one channel by itself. Question, yeah?
Did you control for single and multi? Because a multi-channel is by definition already given two gifts.
Yes.
We know from that a two-gift donor is going to retain better than a one-gift donor. So did you control for that in the data?
It's a good question. So we know that people who give multiple gifts automatically have a better retention rate. We did control for that in the fact that in a lot of multi-gift analysis, you're looking at one channel or the other, like a multi-gift offline person or a multi-gift online person. So we did control for it in here because we wanted to look at a very specific type of donor, the donor that does give online and offline. And when we look at retention rate, we look at reactivation rate, any of those really good positive metrics, multi-channel always outperforms the others. And it's not just because, well, of course they made multiple gifts, but when you sort of normalize the data, you see very positive trends in that area. Talk about trend number 2. After a while, online giving becomes really predictable. I know sometimes it thinks because this stuff changes so fast and there's new tools and new techniques that there's a lot of volatility. Well, the reality is when you look at enough data for enough time, you see patterns. You see things that continue to happen over and over again that become predictable. And that can be really useful for planning purposes. So one thing that a lot of us have heard about is the predictability of December giving. So how many of you have seen a tweet, read a blog post, seen an email about how much giving happens in December, right? So it's true. About 22% of online giving happens in December. The lowest percentage in the entire year is in January, only about 5%. So it's true that happens. But I would also argue that this is a giant trap. That when we hear people talking about you need to make sure you're doing all this giving in the last 2 weeks of the year, that you're getting into a very crowded space. Think about all the retail advertisements you get in the last 2 weeks before a holiday or something taking place. That's the exact same thing that my concern is that happens in the nonprofit sector, which is everybody's emailing the past 2 weeks. Everybody's trying to give that giving. And it can become a real problem from a trap perspective because you get crowded out by other voices, other things that are going on. So this is one of those examples of, yes, it is true that that's when all the giving happens. Does it necessarily mean it's a good thing? And I would say no. Now, when we do look at the data and we look at it by different sectors, we do find that not all organizations behave that same way. So 2 examples here, both in the education space and with environment and animal welfare organizations. So the first thing you'll notice is within education, yes, in December, 25% of their overall online giving happens in December. Yes, that's true. But look at June. June has this weird spike, right? Almost 12% of giving happening in June. Wow, was something happening in June? Does anyone know what happens in June? Well, graduation, fiscal year, bingo, yes. And so if you've ever worked in an education institution or know and love those that do, you find that they run on a fiscal calendar and they spend a lot of time in June and July trying to get in those last gifts because they're bonused on that. It's part of their comp program. It's part of a goal. And so there's a flurry of activity of doing things to get gifts. And it has nothing to do with Santa Claus or anything else. It is an artificially created spike in the giving that is more through spending a lot of time and attention and focusing on doing it. So to me, it's an example of, can you get spikes to happen in other places besides end of year? Yes, you can do that. Both education and with some healthcare organizations, you see that happening. The other sector that's interesting is environment and animal welfare. So you see, if you look at most of their months, it's very even keel, right? 3.5%, 4.5%. It's much more evenly distributed throughout the rest of the year. And one of the reasons for that is over the past decade or so, a lot of these organizations have bought into sustainer donors, monthly donors. And so they don't have the ups and downs and the fluctuations that other sectors have because I'm giving $20 a month, I'm giving $30 a month, and I'm going to continue to be giving that over a period of time. And it helps to smooth out the bumps. And if many of you talk to colleagues at these organizations who have very good monthly donor programs, they'll tell you that it was a lot easier going through the recession because that's much more predictable revenue, right? It's much more predictable revenue to know that someone's donating $20 a month for 12 months as opposed to depending on that one-time $200 online gift. The next thing that's becoming predictable is this. Anyone know what this is? Yep, average online gift. So in 2012, the average online gift was $146. Now, I will admit, I have a love-hate relationship with the average gift amount. Every year I get asked, what is it? I've called it a vanity metric at times. But recently I've learned to sort of love the online average gift amount when you dig into the data and it's not just the $146 because people will say, that doesn't look like us, or we're a lot more, or we're a lot less. And that's true. When you break down average gift by sector, you see differences. So for example, arts and cultural, average online gift is around the average, $144. Education, way off the charts, $629 is an average online gift. Healthcare organizations, 94. So you might sort of wonder, why is healthcare lower? That sort of doesn't make sense until you look at the ways in which a lot of healthcare organizations raise a lot of money online, which is through peer-to-peer fundraising. We know peer-to-peer fundraising typically has lower donation amounts, but much higher volume. And so that will naturally lead to a lower average online gift amount. But these are also organizations who are raising tens of millions of dollars online. It's just a different approach. And so where these types of metrics are useful is for benchmarking purposes. Like you can see this, you can put your own organization into one of these sectors and say, does this look like us? Or if we were closer to what the average is for our sector, how would we be performing? How would we be doing? And that's where benchmarking becomes important. The way I've always sort of described benchmarking is if you and I are being chased by a bear, I'm not going to try and outrun the bear. I just try and outrun you. That's benchmarking, right? And so this can be very useful information when you're getting ready for that board meeting or that internal meeting to sort of say, how are we doing, and having data to compare it to peers. The other thing that's true about average gifts is there's a ton of seasonality when it comes to average online gifts. And so, yes, we see that when giving goes up in December, not ironically, average online gift also goes up a lot. in December, right? And so there are variances through the year when people do give more on an average online gift. I'll touch on this a bit later, but this also brings up the issue of if you're always having the same ask string and you're not doing testing with that and there's no variability, you are more than likely or almost guaranteed you're leaving fundraising dollars on the table because you're not adjusting them out. Donors do behave differently throughout the calendar year. It keeps showing up in the data both by sector and time of year. That's really important, so something to pay attention to. Sometimes we look at data and it doesn't really tell us anything. So we looked at about $4 billion in online giving to see if day of week made a damn bit of difference. And except for Sundays and Saturdays, it really doesn't. You could say, well, Monday's slightly higher, and you could get into these esoteric conversations about why. But for the most part, most online giving happens Monday through Friday. Some days are up, some days are down. Check your own data. Your mileage may vary. So day of week doesn't matter as much. But when you look at hour of day, there's a definite pattern, right? There's a definite cyclical pattern. And again, when you look at billions of dollars in online giving that follow this pattern, and so we normalize this for Eastern time, right? We're on Central time here. But you see it creep up in the morning. There's sort of a peak around 11 to 12. There's a bit of a dip, and then it goes back up between 2 and 3, and then it goes back down, and then it just repeats over and over again on a cyclical basis. Yeah, question in the back.
Do you have data in terms of how this relates to the timing of emails and field search and stuff? Like, is this happening because that's when people are sending us messages, or is this just traffic to your website?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, does it have anything to do with what you're actually doing to drive it? That's a great question. My guess is it must be coming from somewhere. So we didn't correlate, is that because an email happened? But I think the point is, as you're planning email campaigns and doing things, you have to look at human behavior when people do stuff, right? And so I see a lot of orgs, they do we queue the email to go up at 3 a.m. because we want the first thing to be when you get to your inbox, when you get to work. But we do it on a Tuesday because everyone hates email on a Monday. Okay, that's fine, except human behavior says that even on a Tuesday, 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. or whenever you first get in is not when you're most likely to be giving, right? And if you look at enough data, you sort of throw out the outlier. So there becomes a pattern, a window of time when people are doing that. And if you sit down and think about, well, what are people doing typically at 11 to 12 or 2 to 3? You can sort of think about, okay, I could understand why someone receiving an email in that time period, they may be taking a break, going to lunch, in between a meeting. They're pausing for a moment, that there's a window of opportunity to engage with people. I think there was another question. Yeah, we didn't do a correlation between ask. We've done that on sort of individual smaller data sets, but a lot of it is what were you doing, an advocacy-based message? And I would encourage sort of, to sort of also think about this beyond just giving, but also look at advocacy or other areas of what's the time of day in which we're doing this stuff and when are people most responsive to it. Okay. Trend number 3. Online giving is taking the next big step. And so I want to talk about some things that are happening, how nonprofits are using giving in some different ways. But I also want to level set some expectations. So as I said, about 7% of the giving happens online. But keep in mind, 93% of fundraising still happens the old-fashioned way, right? It is through major gifts, annual fund, through the mail, through phone, through traditional channels. 93% still happens that way. And so that has to be a lens that we look through stuff of, am I being multi-channel, knowing a lot of the fundraising revenue is still going to continue to come in through that way. And so for a number of years, we've looked at what's the percentage of online giving that happens online. Last year, it was about 7%. And there is some variation by size of organizations. Actually, smaller organizations receive a higher percentage of their overall fundraising through online, followed by large organizations, and then medium-sized organizations. My theory on why small organizations sort of are doing a higher percentage is they don't have a mail file that's 2 million people. They don't, and a lot of organizations sort of don't have this concept of these very large direct mail, direct marketing programs in place, they're using the internet because it's the best, most effective, efficient tool to do things, and they're getting results in that way. But also keep in mind, it is sort of less than 10% of overall. What's interesting is if you look at retail sales, only about 6% of all retail in the U.S. happens online. So in certain regards, charitable giving is outpacing the trend in the retail sector. And that's a question we get asked a lot of times. Well, isn't retail huge? I'm like, no, it's actually only like 6.5%. So, online giving continues to grow. We do see this fluctuate. And we do see differences by sector. Some raise a much higher percent than others. So, for example, healthcare in 2012 led the way. A little over 14% of overall giving to healthcare organizations came from online. Now, relate this back to, we talked about average gift before. Smaller average gift amount, but higher volume, running different types of campaigns. They're raising a higher percentage. So it isn't all tied up in what the average gift is. It's more around what is your strategy? Is that an area for growth for doing things? You'll see education, only 4.5% of overall fundraising coming from online, even though very high average gift amounts, but it's much lower volume. And so this is important to sort of look at, again, can be used for benchmarking purposes. Where's our organization? If I'm an arts and cultural organization and about 6% of fundraising is coming from online, well, where am I at today, right? Am I at 4%? What would it mean if I was at 6%? Or I'm at 8%. I'm outperforming my peers. Where's my gold star? What could we do next? So again, another way of looking at and hopefully using the data. Now, when we talk about the donations themselves, there's sort of a breakdown of where it comes from. About 90% of online giving comes the old-fashioned way, if it's old-fashioned yet. Online appeals, disaster giving, annual fund appeals where they're asking someone to give. About 9% of online giving comes from what we call peer-to-peer fundraising. So these are the run, walk, ride events, the signature events, independent fundraising, crowdfunding, those types of activities. And probably less than 1%, so I'm probably being generous here, but less than 1% of online giving today comes from what we would consider truly to be social. So it is that Facebook causes piece, or it's the tweet and a donation goes somewhere. I'm not saying that won't grow over time, but I'm also a believer that social is more about friend raising and not fundraising. And then again, if you had to sort of decide where you were going to budget to do things, obviously, traditional online giving and then peer-to-peer has been a tremendous growth source, even though only a small number of, sort of relatively speaking, a small fraction of organizations engage in that type of activity today. So we've seen this growth, but what I've also noticed in the past probably year to 18 months or so are organizations who are doing things in some different ways and sort of taking online giving to the next level. They're going beyond, yes, we have a donation form and we check the box, but really thinking about how to reinvent things. One organization that I think it does a great job is the Humane Society. I actually pulled this up yesterday because I wanted to get a different screen grab of their website, and there's an interrupt pop-up window because right now at Humane Society there's a big campaign going around on the seal hunt in Canada, and there's an immediate online donation here. Now, I know lots of people use these light box windows or pop-up windows or whatever technical term you want to call it, but the other thing that Humane Society does a great job of is goal tracking. So you'll notice the left-hand pane is all about there's a $250,000 goal that is tied around this, and I just took this screen grab yesterday. Over the next few days and weeks, you'll see progress made towards this. And so that's something that you see a lot more organizations doing is they're doing an online appeal, but there's a challenge element involved in that online appeal so that not only can you see what is the goal, but progress towards that goal. In some ways, I think they're borrowing from what you see in the peer-to-peer space. Or if you go to Kickstarter where you're seeing, wow, it's at 25% of the goal or it's 75% of the goal. People get engaged in that way, and so communicating that is another way to sort of change the online giving experience. It's not just fill out the form, but people are connecting with that goal in some different ways. Yeah?
Have you seen any data
Yeah, so the question is sort of default ask amounts. I'm going to touch on that a little bit. I'll make sure I circle back to that one for sure, yeah. Another one that's sort of interesting is for some organizations that may have a national brand, there's also a lot of local affinity. And so a great example of that would be from the Salvation Army. About 2 years ago, when they did a revamp of their online giving experience, they did a lot of research to look into, people know the Salvation Army, but they identify with the Salvation Army at a local level. And so where they want that gift to go isn't necessarily a particular program. They want it to go to a particular location. So if you go to their donation form, one of the options is, where would you like this gift to go? But it's a location where it goes. And as you pick a state, and if you start to type in Minneapolis, it autofills to say, oh, is this the Salvation Army Corps that you want to donate to? And that's powerful because it allows that donor to have a different type of experience because for the research, they learned that giving locally was really important to donors. But how do you make that easy? How do you make that straightforward and change that giving experience and maybe from what was done in the past? When you look at enough sites and you see some things, you see clever and innovative stuff. This is an example from Oxfam America. This is actually the footer of the page on their site. So they use a donation, rather than there's only one donation form and all places go to it, on the footer of the site, they've embedded a very simple, straightforward footer. Mercy Corps also does a great job of this around certain campaigns that they're running. There's what they sort of call a donation bar that's a main element on the homepage along with other content. But again, it's sort of putting that donation experience in other places because I'm only asking someone to take the first step here, right? Select an amount or put another amount in, and when I click donate, then it takes me to the full form, right? So it's a way to get that process started to drive things forward, right? So there's a lot of innovative stuff that's happening, and a lot of things that's coming through testing and people trying stuff. Now, for years, I've heard people have this debate about ask amounts and is it horizontal or is it vertical? No, it's horizontal. Nope, it's left to right, right to left. No, it's up and down and all this type of stuff. And so we heard this for a long time, and we wanted to go and try and figure out, well, what the heck is happening? So it turns out that if you just spend a lot of time focusing on, vertical, horizontal, that you will completely miss what actually works and what people pay attention to. And so let me sort of give you an example of this. Paying attention to left or right or up and down, you can do all the testing in the world. You'll eventually find it doesn't make a damn bit of difference in most cases. And so what you'll realize is you have to try something different. And one of the things that we found in a lot of testing is that this works. That it's not horizontal or vertical, it's the experience. That it's not a radio button, it's a button. Humans love big buttons. If you put something with a big button on it, I guarantee you the number of clicks will go up because we are humans and we click on big buttons. The other thing is, I don't think it is as much about how much you're asking for, because that does vary by donor. But what I can tell you works is, if you pre-select a gift amount, it has a bigger influence on the results of your online giving than leaving it to human choice. So in this example, I've got a very simple ask string here, 25, 50, 75, 100, and other. And they're buttons, because everyone loves buttons, and it also works a hell of a lot better on a mobile device. And I've already pre-selected 75 because I look at my data and I have a sense of my average or even median gift is about this month. And I'm going to pre-select 75 because I'm also playing into the human psyche, which is when that's pre-selected, I have a choice I have to make as a donor. I have to actually choose to give you 25 and not 75, or give you 50 and not 75, as opposed to we don't want to make any choices for you, we let you pick. If you test in this scenario, you would actually find higher average gift amounts. You may see a change in conversion rate, but if you play your cards right, you're more than likely to make that up on the revenue side because of those average gift amount differences. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, so with ask amounts, anything about dynamic versus static. Obviously, anything you can do that's more personalized, that, giving. Most people don't show up at the website and decide, hey, I'm going to give today. They're directed there. And directing people to forms with appropriate ask amounts is always the best route. I think what you find in testing is that you're always, at any particular point in time, testing different ask strings to see which perform better. The other thing, if we look back at the average gift amount, more nonprofits are going into a mode of, as part of the end-of-year fundraising campaign, they're going to naturally adjust those amounts. Or if they're segmenting to a particular donor that they know in the past has given at a certain level, they're going to direct them to a site that doesn't have the option of something below that particular threshold. The other thing you're starting to see more of, too, on the donation form side is for those organizations who really want to grow the monthly sustainer, it used to be that it was sort of an either-or. Do you want to give a one-time gift or a monthly gift? And again, you're forcing someone to make this decision versus if you really want to grow the monthly sustainer program, you kind of have to go all in. And so you do see organizations like ASPCA and Humane Society and some others where monthly is the primary option. And to find the one-time gift, you have to dig somewhere or have to be directed there. Now, again, that's can sometimes be a hard conversation to have internally because your first year revenue, will take a hit. If you're going from an average gift of $125 and now you're going to $20 a month and there's retention issues there. But I think organizations who've really bought into the idea of monthly sustainers are willing to go all in online and direct people that particular direction. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So the question was around tying a giving circle or giving club to a particular amount or the whole virtual gift catalog thing, which is a different animal, sort of no pun intended. So if you're in the giving society, if that is a known entity or part of the giving experience for your organization, so it's very common, like in education, there's different club levels or things like that, and people know that when they're giving or they're joining at a particular level, that's what they're doing at. I think that's more vertical focused in terms of the different org and what it is that they're doing. Then does that work better or not? I mean, the general rule of thumb is you have to keep it simple and as simple as possible. And simple can be hard because I know there's always a tendency of, but we just want to add the one more field on the form and not realizing the implication of sort of what that does to conversion rate. The other thing about sort of the symbolic gift catalogs, there are a bunch of organizations that do them. I think the pattern that we've seen in the past few years is some orgs who've experimented with them have decided, yeah, that's not something we want to continue to be doing. I sort of wonder at times if that's sort of it's hot today and not so hot tomorrow. Some orgs have experimented with it and done well, and others have tried it and not seen the results. You get into a really fine line around is that really the thing that you're giving to or not? And lawyers don't really like that type of stuff in terms of donor intent and what you're actually giving to. Yeah, well, some Earth Justice likes lawyers, right? Yeah. Question in the back, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, how much, in an example of a light box, how much do you try to condense the form to get it all done in one step? So in general, one step works better than multi-step. One step will always work better than multi-step. The key thing to remember is, at the very least, you need a certain amount of information to validate the card. And if you got CVV settings and all that, AVS stuff turned on. So less is always more. Again, though, think about that prompt of a light box is for a very specific goal, a very specific purpose where time, shortening the amount of time to complete that transaction is really important. You may have other things that you're raising funds more programmatic related, where time isn't as big of an issue, right? Where the form might be slightly longer. I think what I generally see the problem of is too much content, other content on the pages, and also just a lot of extraneous fields and information that don't make a lot of sense to the donor, and things like that that sort of make the process more convoluted. Yeah. Trend number 4. So event fundraisers outperform third-party fundraisers. And so we recently put out a report called the Blackbaud Peer-to-Peer Fundraising Benchmark Study. We looked at about 1,200 nonprofit organizations, a little over 28,000 events, and over $1 billion raised online to sort of look at some patterns in sort of peer-to-peer fundraising. And there's a bunch of great stuff in the report. You can find it at blackbaud.com/P2P benchmark. But the thing I keyed in on was some of the findings we found between the differences between athletic type of events and third-party or community events. And that's important because, you know, we've seen the 60 Minutes story about Kickstarter, and we hear a lot about crowdfunding and independent events. And it's been interesting to watch that evolve over time because a lot of these other sort of traditional events have been in place over time. So a couple things I sort of pulled out here. One, you look at average online gift to a athletic event versus a community event, and the average gift size is about the same. And you would actually expect that to be true, that even if it's I'm running in the New York City Marathon or I'm raising funds for a particular project, I'm asking peers and friends and family, and it's a different type of relationship. So I would expect those average gift amounts to be the same. Where things start to turn in a different direction, and there's a clear distinction between these traditional athletic events and community events, is when you look at things like the percentage of participants who actually raise money as a part of that event. You start to see differences in behavior start to emerge. So for example, with a athletic or a marathon type of event, 75% of participants raise money as a part of it, as opposed to only about 46% on the community event side. And so part of what that tells us is that the scale that you have to get that community event to be anywhere sort of near some of the traditional athletics events is very different because those people are engaging in a different way. A smaller percentage of them are actually raising money as a part of that experience. And those are things you need to take into account in your budgeting and your planning for the event, that you're going to need more participants, or how you set your goal may be different because of it's not a challenge event, it's a local community event. The other thing that we find as well, and this sort of gets to be a bit of an eye chart, but that's why you can read the whole report, has to do with the use of email in these tools. And so we know that in general, the more email that individuals who raise money through peer-to-peer send, the better they perform. Now, this is also extending to social and mobile and other things, but one thing that almost every org in the event space looks at is how much email is going out, what's the frequency, what's happening with that. And what you do definitely see are different trends between traditional athletic events and community events in terms of the amount of email that's being sent. And again, if the purpose of that community event is from a fundraising perspective, it signals to you, I've got to drive more activity. I may have to do more reminders to people participating in that community event around the fundraising aspect, or you're at this % of your goal, you're really close to the next step, those types of things. So again, there are some behaviors that are different. I think over the next couple of years, as you see more independent fundraising grow and more organizations doing that type of fundraising, there's a ton that you can learn from the sort of athletic and traditional events sector in terms of what works and what doesn't. As I said before, I don't really see in the data social being a driving factor for fundraising, except for one thing, which is in the peer-to-peer space. Every single time we look at the data, when you look at peer-to-peer fundraising events, whether it's an athletic event like a walkathon or a marathon or even a community-based fundraising event, social and the social component of that does turn into fundraising dollars in some really meaningful ways. Now, that seems obvious because it is, right? These are individuals engaging with other people in their community. There's a connectedness, and so it is not surprising that when I'm, running in the Boston Marathon and I'm using Facebook and Twitter to communicate with people and tell them about the cause and get them interested, that works. And that is a very different type of workflow, if you will, than an organization going on Twitter or Facebook and raising funds that way. And so there is an outlet where we have very clearly see again and again in the data that the use of social, mobile, with the combination of peer-to-peer does work. A very, it's not just a bunch of outliers, but this is an area in particular where we do see a lot of success from a fundraising perspective. Trend number 5. Everything is now mobile. Everything is now mobile. For the past, I think, 2 or 3 years, I put this slide in my presentations, and it's the Morgan Stanley report that says sometime in 2014, there'll be more mobile devices on the internet than desktop devices on the internet. And each year that I show this, we're 1 year closer, we're almost there, things are happening. And I have a blank slide. And what I've seen over the past couple of years is a lot of organizations diving in and using mobile in a lot of different ways. For some organizations, the whole site is mobile friendly, and we've gone that route. Others have said, we're just going to focus on making giving or signing up for an event or taking an action to be mobile friendly. The one thing I've learned from years and years of sort of seeing a lot of web redesigns is there's somewhat like capital campaigns in that you're either starting a website redesign in the middle of a website redesign, or you need a holiday because you just ended your website redesign. And so if you have not taken into consideration mobile and responsive design as a part of that, that's a problem, right? That you have to really seriously look at mobile from that experience. And whether it's the whole site, just portions. I've spent a lot of time in the past year working with a lot smaller nonprofits. This is a Habitat for Humanity chapter in Durham, right? Not a large organization. But when I go to their donation form on their website, on a mobile device, it is simple. It is straightforward. I can mash the button, right? And it's not a complicated process. And so, you're seeing this happen. You're also seeing, in addition to now sort of mobile from a fundraising perspective, but mobile opens up a lot of possibilities. Here are 2 examples of using SMS, one from the Humane Society, other from the Nature Conservancy. And every once in a while, they send me a text message. And they send me a text message just like they send me direct mail pieces or email or other types of things. And what they're looking for me to do is take that next action, click on that link. Now, what they know is that when you get an SMS message, you look at it, you respond to it, you do something with it. I would be willing to bet that most of you would respond faster to an SMS message than an email if one was miraculously broadcast right now in the meeting, right? And so, again, mobile is not just the giving piece of it as well, but it's another way to communicate and engage with volunteers, with activists, with other types of individuals. So there's been a lot of talk about mobile. You need to pay attention. And there's always this notion, sort of the Malcolm Gladwell of tipping point. When do we get to a tipping point where mobile is really, really important? And I think with mobile, we're there. We're at a tipping point. But it's not from a direction that most people have been talking about. I actually think that the tipping point for mobile is email and not all the other stuff. That we're over the chasm here from a mobile perspective. And this chart hopefully illustrates it. This is some data from Litmus, who's one of the larger email providers, preview companies out there. And when they look at 172 million email opens in February, the number one place where that is being read is Apple iPhone, then Outlook, then iPad, then Apple Mail, then Google Android. So of those top 5, 1 or 2 of them are desktop stuff, but the rest is all mobile. And unless you're still chained to Lotus Notes, and I feel bad if you are, or you're using Outlook, you're using a mobile client to review those messages. I'm waiting for the day when we no longer at the top of an email have to put, If you can't view this, please click here, because you're in a browser already, right? You're wasting that space in a lot of cases. So I think where you're seeing mobile now already today and yesterday is on the email side, right? And if you think about a couple stats, 90% of smartphone owners access email on both mobile and desktop, right? How many of you checked email in the past hour? Yeah, right? You're not chained to your desk somewhere. It goes where you are, right? That's the thing. And how many of you are going to look at your email after this session, right? Yeah. 45% of holiday season emails are being opened on mobile. So again, think about where you are in the holiday season, where you're receiving that email, does it work or not? 38% of email now open on a mobile device. And as you go younger, 66% of people under 30 use mobile devices to access email. I know there's a lot of talk about young people don't use email, but once you get a job, you sort of have to, unfortunately, and they're using that on a mobile device and not other places. And the reason why this is important is because the vast majority of online giving is directed, and it is directed through email. And so if I receive that fundraising appeal email in my mobile device and it looks like crap, or it doesn't work and it's not connected to a mobile donation form, that's like this giant epic fail whale. That is a big problem for those things not to work. And so, yes, you have to have a responsive website and responsive donation forms. But email is more than likely the thing you're not paying attention to that you've got to make sure that works well. Because you can send them somewhere that's mobile friendly, but if the first point of contact doesn't work well from a mobile perspective, that's a huge problem. And so email is a great place. You can absolutely start, focus there now. Technology is not the limiting factor, but it's another area where you can definitely start to see how people are embracing mobile, how people are doing things with that. And the reason I bring this up is this is from the latest M&R and NTEN e-benchmarking report. You know, email, we have sort of a problem, right? Open rate down, conversion rate down. These things are problematic. And so in part, I think this is also a need to be much more responsive from a mobile perspective, to think about where are people receiving these messages, what are they doing with them, and how can I change that in some different ways. The other thing I'd note is for the past 2 years, I save up all the emails I receive throughout the year, and then I look at all the emails that I get in the month of December. And I've blogged on this a couple of times, but these are all the subject lines from the holiday from December 1st to December 31st, 2012, and did sort of a Wordle on the stuff that shows up. And it's a great way to just sort of see in mass scale what are people trying and what's happening. And so a couple of trends that I picked out in particular on the email side of, you know, ways to improve what's working. One, there's much more use of challenges as a part of email. And I will use the word challenge over and over and over because people respond to those things. We like a challenge. Goals, you know, we'll deal with goals. I like a challenge. People like a challenge. People know what that means. In this past year, we saw a lot less emphasis on tax deduction. I don't know if this had to do with what's happened in Washington or what, but in past years, I've seen much more use of, you know, donate now, don't forget about your deduction. Less emphasis on that. Also worth noting, fun fact of the day, only about 35% of Americans itemize their taxes. So unless you fall into that group, this is of absolutely no benefit to you whatsoever. So that's just, my accountant told me to say that. Faux forwards are bad. How many of you seen the faux forward of, well, you know, it's forward and then there's the subject line. It's like, yeah, you didn't really forward that to me. Faux forwards are bad. I see less of them, but every time I see them, it's just like, do you think I'm dumb? Like, I know what a forward is. This was not one of those things. And size doesn't matter. You know, I've seen really smaller organizations do amazing email campaigns. There's an org in Washington, D.C., Bread for the City, that did a challenge gift, but they're not a very large organization, but they got a anonymous donor to match up to a certain amount of giving that happened the end part of the year. And when you went to their donation form, they had much higher than average gift amount than they did the rest of the year. So, you know, this isn't a technology factor. It's more of the strategy. What are you trying to do? I would also note some personalization beats no personalization. Dear Steve is always going to work better than dear friend. And yes, we would love to have the world of, thank you for your last gift amount of X. Would you please consider a gift of Y? Those things are great, but even some level of personalization works. Personalization in the subject line still creeps me out a bit. Test at your own peril, your mileage may vary, that whole side of things. The other thing I'd sort of talk about email real quick is we saw every time there's a political election, whether it was Howard Dean or anybody else, all these new ideas come up, right? And we've seen a lot of articles about the use of big data, a lot of articles about online giving. And my point would be, one, you're not running a presidential campaign, so it's an outlier. But two, there was a great article in Business Week that talked about sort of the online fundraising machine that the Obama campaign ran. And the biggest takeaway from it was they didn't guess, ever. They knew, based on testing, that when they sent something, what was going to happen. And this is true. Everyone sort of says, well, you need to test, you need to test. You need to test. The good news is the more you test, the better you get in your results. And so what the article talks about is, they would test lots of different subject lines, and then they would find out, well, which one is performing enough in the sample set that tells us that's the one that we want to use this time. Now, again, you're not a presidential campaign, but it is very clear that they did a lot of testing to look at what segments, what subjects, those types of things work over time. And that's a pretty powerful thing to be able to use. So those were 5 things. I have a couple more things that I've plugged in here that I want to talk about. And to sort of start it off is a way of thinking about how we have our perspective about things in the nonprofit sector, how we make decisions. I know Dan Pelota talked a lot this morning about the way we think about charity is wrong in certain ways, and that was some of the subject of his talk. But it's also when we're planning and deciding to do things, sometimes our perception is often a little bit off from reality. And so here's an example to think about. Does anyone know how long the white line is in the middle of the road when you're driving on a highway? Anyone know how long the white stripe is? 4 feet? 3 feet? Anyone else want to guess? 8 feet? It's 10 feet. The size of the white line is federally mandated is 10 feet, with 30 feet between each stripe. So it's 40 feet. Now, we don't think of that because we're driving 80 miles an hour. And we're also not looking right in front of us at what's happening right now. We're looking at least 80 feet down the road for the thing that's coming up. And 80 feet down the road, that line does look smaller because it's depth perception. We have this skill. It's really amazing. This happens with us in nonprofit organizations. And it's not our fault, right? We have lots of stuff going on, right? We have 5 hats we're wearing. Our perception gets thrown off. And our perception, unfortunately, gets thrown off at sometimes not the best time, right? It's, wow, there's this new thing on Twitter for 6-second videos. We immediately need to go and do that, right? Because our perception is skewed by something, because we got all of these things going on. And so there's 2 areas in particular that I've caught on in the past year or so that I wanted to talk about of how our perceptions get skewed, but more importantly, what to do about it. And the first is big data. So if I hear the phrase big data one more time, I'm going to throw something. I believe that big data is actually the problem, not the thing you're trying to solve. In the nonprofit sector, for the past 30 years or so, we've been collecting data in systems, and data upon data upon data upon data. And that's big data. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything. We just have lots of it. And we hear about big data and needing to do these things, but sometimes we can't tell, is that white line on the highway 2 feet, 3 feet, or 10 feet, and how fast is it coming? So here's something I'd toss out to think about big data. Think about information. Think about the things you're using. So the first thing is, there are things we know, right? We know we raised this amount of money last year. We know that in September we are having this event because we've had that event for 10 years. We know that, right? Then there are things sometimes we don't know we know. I didn't know our retention rate was that. Did you know our retention rate was that? Did you know that we have this percentage of traffic coming from mobile? We didn't know that. So things we know, we don't know, we know. Then there are things we know, we don't know. I don't know what's going to happen a year from now. I can't predict the future. We don't know how a particular new capital campaign is going to perform. We don't have a crystal ball. And then there's the last area, the area that's the hardest for humans. There are the things we don't know that we don't know. And this can be paralyzing in a lot of cases. Let me give you an example of the thing we don't know that we don't know. When you look at donor retention, you can spend a lot of time in spreadsheets and pivot tables trying to figure out why do some donors retain better than others, right? You can spend a lot of time on that. How many of you at least spent 10 minutes at some point in time trying to figure that one out, right? The problem is there's a blind spot. There's something that you don't know that's preventing you from getting where you want to be, which is there's two variables that really highly predict donor retention, and they are, first, does that person still live at the address that you're sending mail to, right? You don't know that you don't know that. I know the post office says that they forward mail, but they only do it for a certain period of time, right? And the other thing that you don't know is that donor also giving to any other charitable organizations? It may not be that they're not just giving to you. They've stopped giving to everyone, right? And those are two pieces of information that you're not going to have in your system. Your system isn't going to tell you, does that person actually still live there? And your system more than likely doesn't tell you, is that person still giving to any nonprofit, not just ours? And so being this sort of the state of the world, here's one way I'd sort of recommend to think about stuff, right? Is put the things you're working on in these buckets. There may be things we know we don't know, and what you just want to do is move it to the thing we know column, right? Or there may be things we don't know we know that you want to move to that bucket. And don't get too fixated and focused on the we don't know what we don't know type of problem. That stuff's really hard, right? IBM is trying to solve that type of stuff. You're much better off of thinking about how do we move something to a place where we know what we know. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be somewhere in between, but that's an area to focus on. And that's ultimately what all this big data stuff boils down into, is trying to take information and turn it into something that we know from something that we weren't aware of before. The next thing I want to talk about is change. There's lots of tips and tools and techniques. There's tons of stuff you can do to improve online fundraising. But the thing I keep seeing over and over again is what's the appetite for change in the organization to do this? Because if I told you that big buttons with a pre-selected amount work, why doesn't everybody do that on Monday, right? There's a change factor involved. And it turns out that change is really hard. Everyone likes change. No one likes changing. And there's something called the change equation, which is why this happens. So let me talk about this for a second. So when does change happen? Change happens when there's enough dissatisfaction with the current system and everyone has a clear vision of where you want to go, and there's some first steps in that direction. But here's the kicker. All those things have to be bigger than the resistance to change, right? You may have a lot of dissatisfaction, but not enough dissatisfaction to overcome the resistance to change, right? And you may have a lot of dissatisfaction and a goal or a vision statement for where you want to go. But if you don't have some first steps to show some people that that's the direction it's going, you are not going to overcome the resistance to change. So one thing I'd sort of ask you guys to think about between now and next year's NTC is when you're thinking about introducing something new, when you're trying to get people to change, sit down and plug in the numbers. Think about it, right? what is the level of dissatisfaction? And is everybody that dissatisfied, or some people, well, it's not so bad, we could live with it, right? Have you shown the clear vision of where you want to go and what does that look like, and do people understand that? And probably the real key to it is, are you showing some first steps in that direction? It doesn't mean you have to be 3/4 of the way to the destination, but you don't get to the destination unless you at least take a few steps forward. Those are the key things to overcome the resistance, and that's really ultimately what drives change, whether it's in the organization, in a program, or in something else. If you can't get enough of any of this stuff, you can follow me on Twitter. Blackbaud has a great blog called NP Engage, where there's tons of content and information. Occasionally, there's a cat video or two. And as I mentioned, a lot of this data analysis we publish on a monthly basis on the Blackbaud Index. Thanks for your time. Happy to take questions, answers, or anything in between. Thanks. No questions. It's easy. Yeah.
Going back to, I don't know which one it was, but the time of day giving or the day of week giving, did you also look at day of month giving?
Yeah, so the question is, when we're looking at day of week, week of day, day of hour, did we also sort of look where those fall? We didn't, because that was data over a 1.5-year time period. And I mean, there's variations in there. You get things like Giving Tuesday come up, or Hurricane Sandy. We try to take enough data so that the spikes wouldn't throw it off. Obviously, if I just looked at hour of day in December, it would be different than April and some things like that. But part of it is there's patterns, right? This stuff there's enough of this happening now where there's enough data, there's enough patterns for you to adjust things, or at least try things. In a lot of cases, it may be stop doing one thing and start doing another. Yeah. Yes, so the question is, have we looked at mobile giving in terms of those trends? There's not enough sort of high percentage of that giving, but the thing that happens, though, is you're receiving that message, you're receiving that, and so I would not expect mobile to change when people give. There may be a slightly higher convenience factor because it's with you, but I think it has more to do with what are people doing during certain time periods of the day. I would actually say that maybe having your mobile phone with you maybe expands some of those zones. Maybe you see more giving starting to happen in evening hours because you're not at a desktop. But that would obviously be a really interesting thing to keep looking at for sure. Any answers? I'll take answers too. Great, thanks. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure. So the question had to do with recurring giving, and is giving the donor the option of what day of the month that they want to give on have any bearing on conversion rate? No. Sorry, there is no data that tells me that giving the option to control the date that they give on for the monthly gift has any impact on whether or not someone gives monthly or not. That decision happens in advance. The good news is we have years of data on that from overseas, where recurring giving is much more the norm. I would argue, even on the nonprofit side, it is much more painful to give that type of flexibility to a donor because the internal sort of problems that can create. But we found nothing in the data that says, you didn't let me give on the 12th because I want to give on the 12th, you're forcing me the 1st and the 15th. There's really no correlation there, and sort of a decrease on conversion rate. Yeah, so maybe one question back. Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, there's some organizations that I think do a better job of asking for online donations and figuring out when they ask and things like that. Do you have any information, if you take into account organizations that will say, we've got a big story in the media about something related to our work, and they can ask, versus organizations that just send out emails saying we'll give some money, things like that. Do you
Sure. So let me see if I can sum up the question. Is there any difference between organizations who are opportunistic about giving because there's a news event or something that happens versus just not randomly, but just they're just asking on some predetermined basis? The reality is you have to be prepared for both, right? I know people like to think that only certain organizations have these disaster or major event scenarios, and that doesn't happen to us. Every single organization has something like that. It may not be a hurricane or an earthquake, but there's something else, and you need to be prepared in advance or sort of opportunistic in advance to do those things. And the reality is, online is the first response channel of choice for donors, right? They're not going to wait for the thing to show up in the mail 3 weeks later to decide that's the thing they're going to do. They're going to go online first, and the more you have things in place to respond to that type of stuff is really important. I think you've seen a lot of organizations in the past year or so get much better at responding to items in the news and things like that and tying that back to the giving that they're doing. And that works because we know that works in the retail sector and everywhere else. And nonprofits are starting to get attuned to that in terms of how they think about doing things. I sort of don't believe in accidental donors. I don't believe in the data that someone decides one day to show up at the website and donate. And nor do I believe you should optimize around that experience. That's not really how most things happen. Someone is sent something, the number one reason why someone gives is they're asked. Now, how they're asked varies lots and lots of ways, but that's the key thing. It could be through SMS, it could be through email, it could be through something else, but that starts off that first step, and that's how most of it happens in the sector. Yeah. Yeah, yep. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, one of the things that we have found that absolutely does work is making it clear as a part of the donation process, when is that payment going to be processed, and is that first thing today or is it later? And that does, I have seen that does have a definite impact on giving if you make it very clear, thank you for becoming a monthly donor, and being very explicit and very clear of, and your next monthly donation will be on X, right? And being very clear about that, because was it George Bernard Shaw said that the greatest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. People see stuff, sometimes you have to repeat it a few times for them to understand, yeah, that's right, it is the 15th, or it's the 12th, or whatever it happens to be. Absolutely. Yeah.
One more question. I know a lot of folks don't want to make more than one ask in email. So if you're doing a sort of action email or petition or something like that, you wouldn't want to necessarily ask something in there. Do you have any data that shows whether organizations that integrate that do raise more money, or whether they just get less effective?
So the question is, when you're asking someone to take another type of action, like for example, an advocacy action, to what degree are you also having a fundraising ask as a part of it, that type of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, do you actually raise more money by adding that in, or is it just the press reaction?
This is a generalized statement without looking at a bazillion amount of data, but what I've seen is asking for a donation as a part of asking someone to do another action works. I think we've done some research in the past that in terms of advocacy, there's a definite tie between people taking advocacy action and also being donors. They're more likely because they took that action, which is really important. I think what you're seeing happen, it's more about when does that ask happen. And the trend I've seen in the past year is less about in that email that's a call to action, like, an advocacy action, but I'm seeing that donation switch to things like, after I've taken the advocacy action, after I've taken that step, seeing a lot more of the ask for a donation after that, because you've already taken that first step. There's already a heightened set of engagement. So I think what you're seeing happen is, yes, people are asking, but they're moving where in the next step does that fundraising ask happen. A lot of organizations have welcome series programs or sort of after action programs where when you take an advocacy action, you're putting into a certain type of cultivation cycle. And at some point in a relatively short period of time, there is a fundraising ask, and you see how that works or doesn't work, and you move people around in your segments, based on that for sure. Yep. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.